In this second lesson, we look at the brain, the nerves, and the reflex arc. In the first lesson, the homework was to draw the brain, a section through the brain, and to label and write on the functions of the various parts. So when we look at a section through the brain, the largest part is what we call the cerebrum. The cerebrum has three functions. Namely, it controls all voluntary actions. So any action that is within your control. In the previous topic, we spoke about the difference between voluntary actions and involuntary actions, and we looked at a number of examples. So if, for example, you'd like to walk somewhere, your cerebrum will control this process. If you want to talk, which is a voluntary action, your cerebrum will control that process. It also receives and interprets sensations from the sense organs. So while you are watching this video, your eyes have the receptors for light. It will see the image. That image will be converted to an impulse. The impulse will go on a sensory neuron to the cerebrum. Your cerebrum will interpret, understand what you are seeing. And if you need to take some action from there, you can respond. Similarly, with your ears, for sound, what you are hearing, the words, the receptors for sound are within the ear. They'll convert that sound through a long process, which we'll learn about a bit later, into impulses, and the impulses will go on a sensory neuron to the cerebrum, and you'll understand the words that you are hearing. Also, it's responsible for higher thought processes, things such as memory, reasoning, thinking, etc. This structure was not required as far as the nervous system and the exam guideline, but it will be something we'll look at with the endocrine system. So while we are here, we'll just show you the location, that this is the hypothalamus. Right? The hypothalamus is the control center for hunger, for thirst, for sleep, for body temperature and emotions. It also produces the hormone ADH, which controls your water balance. Directly underneath the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland secretes many hormones, and we'll speak about it in quite a bit of detail when we get to the endocrine section. Okay, then if we look at the brain, we've got this portion here, which is known as the brain stem. But we don't need to know too much detail about the brain stem. But after this swollen piece, that point is what we know as the medulla oblongata. Right, so the medulla oblongata, it's the point where there's crossing over of nerves. So basically, your right-hand side of your brain controls the left-hand side of your body, and the left-hand side of the brain controls the right-hand side of the body. And the point where those nerves cross over is at the medulla oblongata. It transmits nerve impulses between the spinal cord and the brain, and it controls involuntary actions such as the heartbeat and the breathing rate, which is very crucial for our survival. Underneath the medulla oblongata, that's where the spinal cord begins, and the spinal cord is responsible for reflex actions. It also carries messages to and from the brain. We know that the peripheral nervous system, you're going to have certain sensory nerves that will enter into the spinal cord, take messages up to the brain. From the brain, the response will come out on a motor neuron through the spinal cord and then to the effector. At the back, we've got the small portion which is known as the cerebellum. The cerebellum coordinates all voluntary movements. Right, so you're going to find that the starting of it, the first 5 letters is exactly the same as cerebrum. So we have to be very careful with these two words that we don't mix them up. Right, cerebellum coordinates all voluntary movements. You'll find that with the cerebrum, we said something very similar. We said it controls all voluntary movements. Right, the difference being that if you want to walk, the cerebrum will control it, the cerebellum will coordinate it, meaning to make sure that you're walking in a straight line, you're not falling over, etc. That is coordination, which will be done by the cerebellum. It controls muscle tension, which assists with maintaining balance. So when we speak about the inner ear and the structures that are responsible for balance there, we'll say that they convert the stimuli to impulses, and the impulses will go to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum will interpret those impulses and bring about a response to maintain balance. In the center, we've got this C-shaped structure which joins the right and left-hand side of the brain, and that is known as the corpus callosum. Again, you're going to find there's the corpus luteum we spoke about in the reproductive system. Be careful not to mix these words up. Right, so the function is to connect the two hemispheres of the brain and allow for communication between these hemispheres. Okay, so we're going to look at a few snippets from this video just so we can have a better picture of the structures of the brain. Okay, right, so here you can see the largest part of the brain, which is in pink, being the cerebrum. It's made up of two hemispheres, the right and left hemisphere. In the center, we can see that corpus callosum, which joins them and allows for communication between them. Right, we're going to find that this video is at quite a high level, right? We find that it's maybe at university level, so that's why we're just skipping through to the portions which are relevant to us at the moment. Again, you can see now the cerebrum, we've got the corpus callosum in red there. In green, we've got the cerebellum. They're showing you the medulla oblongata position there as well. The cerebellum, you can see it's at the back of the brain and towards the lower part. Now we look at the different types of nerves that we have in our body. And we want to look at the structures and functioning. On the top, it's telling you that we need to know the structures and functions of the following parts in the sensory and motor neurons. That statement is coming from the examination guideline. So anything which is not there would not be assessed at the end of the year. And therefore, you can see these labels, neurolima, node of Ranvier, Schwann cell nucleus, they are not in the examination guideline. We're going to ignore them. They might be in your textbook, they might be in your study guides, but it will not come in the end of the year exam. And if you do write it, let's say you drew a diagram and you have to label and you put those three labels, you won't be awarded any marks. Right? So it's important that we know about the examination guidelines so we don't overload our cerebral capacity. Okay, so if we look here, I'm going to start with this one on the top, which is a sensory neuron. It starts on the right-hand side with the receptor. Okay, so the receptor, it receives the stimuli, which is the change in environment, and it converts those to electrical impulses, right? Electrical message, which will then move along, right? So that electrical message is made here. It moves along this neuron. And the neuron is very similar to conducting wire. It's like when you talk of a cable, right? So the dendrite carries impulses to the cell body. We'll find that if you use that example of a cable, the copper inside, that would be basically similar to the dendrite in the axon, which carries electricity in a cable, but here it will be carrying the impulse, the dendrite, to the cell body. Right, so dendrite's always taking the direction is to the cell body. You can see they're showing you an arrow here of the direction of the movement of the impulse. Then we've got the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath, if we use the example of a cable, you've got the copper on the inside, which is the dendrites and the axons, and then around that you've got the plastic insulation. So here the myelin sheath is that insulation. It's going to be around the dendrite and axon, and it functions to speed up the impulse transmission, one. And secondly, being an insulator, it prevents short circuits and prevents the impulse from going out of the neuron. Then we have the cell body, which is basically does the normal functioning of a cell. It's got the cytoplasm, it's got a nucleus, which have their normal functions. And then the axon, similar to the dendrite, the only difference is that the axon is carrying the impulse away from the cell body now. So dendrite and axon, basically this and this looks the same. The dendrite is the part that is before the cell body, carrying the impulse to the cell body, and then the axon will carry the impulse away from the cell body. So we'll find that that receptor generates an impulse, it goes through here, it will come to this endpoint, and then when it gets normally to the central nervous system and the sensory neuron ends, you're going to have a small gap called a synapse. It's going to jump to an interneuron. Inter means between. So between a sensory and a motor, we have an interneuron. The interneuron takes the impulse and passes it from the sensory to a motor neuron. The motor neuron, you can see, has many of these branches, which are the dendrites, and the dendrites will carry the impulse to the cell body. Then the cell body will take the impulse through an axon until it goes to the effector, and the effector will bring about the response. If we compare the sensory neuron with the motor neuron, you're going to find that the sensory neuron has only one dendrite which enters into the cell body, whereas the motor neuron has many dendrites that enter in. So sometimes they call the sensory neuron a unipolar neuron, and this one, a motor neuron, a multipolar neuron. But you're going to find that the cell body in a sensory neuron is somewhere in the middle, whereas in a motor neuron, it's at the beginning. It's got these dendrites branching out and go straight into the cell body. So you should be able to identify them. If they give you a diagram of one of them, you should be able to identify which one they're talking about. Okay, so I've been speaking about the exam guidelines. It's a very, very important document. If you don't have it, you can go to the website www.bioats.weebly.com. When you reach the website, the home page looks like this here. You go to grade division, you go to grade 12, you'll find that the first item is the Mind the Gap study guide, and then you have the exam guidelines tab. If you click on it, you'll find we've got it in a format where you can read it from your device. And if you go a bit lower, there's a download file option, and you can download this and have it as an important reference when you're studying. All right, you said you should be able to identify the type of neuron. If you look at this neuron, would you be able to identify the type of neuron? Right, the correct answer would be that this is a motor neuron. You can see that there are many dendrites that are entering into the cell body. And then you've got the one axon, a longer axon coming out from the side with the myelin sheets around them. You can see when two neurons are joining, they're joining with the synapse, which is a microscopic gap at the joining point where the impulse will jump over. Okay, so now we move to a reflex action and a reflex arc. Right, the reflex action is defined as a quick automatic response to a stimulus. So certain stimuli normally are harmful stimuli. When you react quickly, very fast, automatically, which means involuntarily, right? So without thinking, and it's a response to a stimulus, that's a reflex action. Then the reflex arc, it's related to that. It's the nerve pathway taken in a reflex action, right? So this is the pathway. How does the impulse move? Right, so a reflex arc, here's an example. Let's say a lady puts her hand into a handbag to get something. She doesn't realize that one of her pins are there in the handbag. And this pin now would be the stimulus, is a change in the environment. If her finger presses against that happen? What will happen is that the receptors will receive the stimulus. It will convert the stimulus to an impulse. The impulse now will travel along this first neuron, which is the sensory neuron. You can see the sensory neuron has the cell body in the middle. And the sensory neuron will go from the hand to the spinal cord. It enters through the top of the spinal cord, which is the top area is known as the dorsal part. So it enters through the dorsal root and it goes into the spinal cord. Okay, so now the spinal cord diagram also you need to know about it. Okay, the dorsal means the top area, ventral is the bottom. You've learned about that in grade 11, dorso-ventrally differentiated organisms, etc. Then there's two parts to it. You're going to find on the outside, we have the white matter, and on the inside, what's like a butterfly shape or H shape is what we call the gray matter. So easy labels there. And in the center, it's what we call the central canal. Right? The central canal has cerebrospinal fluid within it. Okay, so we said that the impulse came on the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron enters the spinal cord through the dorsal root, and now it's going to have a synapse, a microscopic gap, and it's going to jump to an interneuron. From the interneuron, it's going to go to the motor neuron. Remember, interneurons are between the sensory and the motor neuron. There'll be a synapse, a microscopic gap that will be jumped over. The cell body will be here of the motor neuron. It goes into the motor neuron. From the motor neuron, it exits through the bottom, which is the ventral root of the spinal cord, and it will go to the muscle, which is the effector, probably the muscle of the arm, and you move the arm away. So that would be the reflex arc. So basically, if a lady puts her hand into the bag and she feels a pin prick and pulls her hand away, pulling the hand away is a reflex action. It will be a quick, automatic response to the stimulus. That's the reflex action, pulling the hand away. But the reflex arc is this entire process. So generally, a reflex arc, there's a stimulus. Stimulus is picked up by a receptor, which will convert it to an impulse. The impulse travels via the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, but going through the dorsal root on the top. Then there's a synapse where this impulse now will jump from the sensory neuron to the interneuron. And then from the interneuron, we're going to have another synapse through which the impulse jumps through the ventral root and to the motor neuron. Right? The motor neuron exits through the ventral, the bottom root, and this will take the impulse to the effector, and the effector will take that away. Right? So a flow diagram is easy for you to remember the key words, but remember, in an exam situation, you won't receive marks for writing in the format of a flow diagram. You need to fill up with full sentences, basically, but the key ideas are there. Okay, so let's watch one video again that shows us the process of a reflex arc. Okay. So here, a person has put some boiling water into a metal cup. We know that metals are very good conductors of heat. So very quickly, a metal cup will get hot compared to a styrofoam cup or plastic or glass cup, etc. Now, a person who wasn't aware of this comes and touches that, and they move their hand away absolutely quickly. So this first part, that's a reflex action, finished. A person, and be very careful with the reflex action, because often people will say stamping on a thorn or touching something that's very hot, that is not a reflex action. Touching it and not moving your hand or foot away would not be a reflex action. The process of removing your body organ from the harm, that's the reflex action. So moving your arm away from that would be the reflex action. The reflex arc would be that heat within there was converted in the receptors of the finger, in the skin, into an impulse, the stimulus, and the impulse you can see moving as an electrical impulse on the first neuron, which we call the sensory neuron. And via the sensory neuron, it enters from the dorsal root nerve, right? So the dorsal root is on the top, and it's going to go into the spinal cord. You can see the butterfly-shaped gray matter on the outside. You've got the white matter, and you've got the central canal in the middle. It will go in there. It's skipping out some of the detail that within that gray matter, there would have been a synapse from the sensory neuron to the interneuron, from the interneuron, another synapse to the motor neuron, and now the motor neuron comes out from the bottom, the ventral root, and it carries on going through the motor neuron until it reaches the correct muscle, and that muscle will remove the hand from the harmful object. But if we look at the pathway, this is the pathway. If you look at that diagram, can you see there's like a C shape on the top? It goes and goes around, and that's why it's called a reflex arc, because the arc is something that has that like a C shape. So if we follow this pathway, we get that C shape, and that's why it's called a reflex arc. We look at another example of a reflex action. That's the knee-jerk reaction, right? So sometimes when a doctor wants to check a person's reflexes, he let a person sit with the leg bent at 90 degrees. If you knock just under the patella, you'll find that the leg kicks out on its own. It's a quick automatic response to a stimulus. It's a reflex action. When knocked with a small hammer here, it's not like the hammer they use from a hardware. It's a rubberized one. You're going to find that it's going to cause the receptors to pick up this stimulus. The stimulus is converted to an impulse. Impulse goes on a sensory neuron. How do we see which one is which neuron in a diagram like this here? Right. So one, the direction. This one is going towards the spinal cord in brain. The sensory neuron always goes to the spinal cord in the brain. But sometimes there won't be that diagram. The other clue is the position of the cell body. Cell body is in the middle. So this would be a sensory neuron. The third clue is that it's coming in from the top. So the sensory neuron is the one that enters from the top. And here's an interneuron here. And here at the bottom, we've got motor neurons. How do we know that these are, you can see in this case, there's two motor neurons that are coming out. We know it's a motor neuron. It starts off with the cell body. It will have dendrites in the cell body in the starting, not in the middle. Two, it's exiting from the bottom, the ventral root. So that's a second clue that's the motor neuron. And third, here they're showing you the direction. It's moving away from the brain and spinal cord. All the ways we're going to find that the motor neurons carry impulses away from the central nervous system. Just another example. If a person touches something that's very hot, in this case, the fire would act as the stimulus. That stimulus is picked up by receptors. Receptors convert the stimulus to an impulse. Impulse goes on the sensory neuron. Through the dorsal root, we have a synapse within the spinal cord, and this goes to the interneuron. Interneuron, another synapse. It jumps over that gap by neurotransmitters, and it goes to the motor neuron, and the motor neuron carries this impulse to the effector muscle, which will pull away the hand from that dangerous stimulus. So the significance or importance of a reflex action is that it protects the body from further damage by reacting very quickly, right? So you might, if you touch a hot plate of a stove without knowing that it was on before that, or if you tramped on a thorn, you will get some damage, but the reflex action will prevent further damage, right? If it wasn't for the reflex action and you reacted a few seconds later, if it had to go to the brain and you had to think and say, I'm in a lot of pain, my hand is on a stove, it's burning. If I don't take my hand away, it's going to cook. Let me take my hand away. If you had to go through a thinking process, those seconds that it would take the brain to respond would lead to more damage happening to your body, right? So the importance of the reflex action is that the reflex arc goes to the spinal cord and comes back directly from the spinal cord. It doesn't go to the brain at all. And that's why we're saying it's an involuntary action, okay? And Because of that, it's a much shorter loop. It doesn't have to go to the brain, so it's quicker, the response, and that quick response is what now protects you from further damage. In the next lesson, we'll continue with the nervous system.